A big storm will be coming to the United States over the next couple of days, and this is going to pose a threat for some significant severe weather both today and tomorrow across parts of the central and northern plains, back over into the Midwest, and even parts of the Ohio Valley. And then we're also going to be talking about two tropical storms that could develop over the next few days, one of which is just east of Florida that might develop over the next few hours, but one that is more likely to develop back over in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico as we go into the weekend and into the beginning of next week. So in today's forecast, we're going to break down everything that you need to know about the weather over the next 7 days, in addition to these big threats. We're going to begin, though, with what's happening across the country right now. And notice we actually have a large cluster of showers and thunderstorms that really began yesterday, and it's still ongoing across parts of the western Midwest and back into parts of the northern plains. It's really just the remnants of the energy that we had yesterday from some of the significant damaging winds and even the low tornado risk that we had in Nebraska yesterday. And if you weren't watching our live stream yesterday, there was a storm back over in Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, which is in western Nebraska, that produced upwards of 100-mile-per-hour winds. It was not confirmed, but it was warned for that, so very possible that we did have some really high winds there. Nonetheless, this is all moving off to the east and northeast, and as we go later into today, we're going to get another corridor of storms to fire off from Nebraska, South Dakota, and even into Montana, all the way back into Wisconsin and even northern Illinois, where more damaging winds, hail, and a few tornadoes will be a possibility today. Now, talking a bit more about the tropics, we have the remnants of Alberto moving to the west over actually into the Pacific Ocean now. This is the center of those remnants, so that's moving now into the Pacific Ocean. Redevelopment is not looking really likely, but that'll continue to move that direction. Done here in the United States with Alberto. We do have an area of convection bubbling off the coast of Florida this morning, and this could turn into some sort of brief tropical depression or storm before it does crash into Florida or Georgia. Now, overall impacts are not expected to be super significant, but we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. And then back over just south of the Gulf of Mexico, we do have a lot of thunderstorm activity here. This will eventually move to the west and northwest into the Gulf of Mexico, and this could eventually pose a threat for a tropical storm across parts of Texas or even back into Mexico, very similar to the area that Alberto just hit as we go into the weekend and into early next week, which again, we'll talk more about that here in just a second. Now, we do have a large storm that's going to be marching across the northern tier of the country over the next couple of days, and this is going to pose a threat for severe weather starting today and going into tomorrow. Beginning with Flying Fences Friday, we do have a large slight risk for severe weather, which goes all the way from Montana back into Wisconsin. It's actually a relatively elongated area. Have another slight risk over in Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, which is not something that you see very often. Large marginal threat outside of that, which goes all the way back over into parts of northern Illinois and Iowa, and there's also a small marginal threat in the northeast. The main concern, though, for today will be damaging winds, large hail. We could even see some very large hail back over in Montana, but notice there are a couple of 5% tornado corridors, one of which is in Minnesota, northern Iowa, and western Wisconsin. Have another one back over in Montana as well, which again, you do not see that very often as well. But overall, today is really going to be mostly a wind and hail day, but we will have a potential for a few tornadoes. We are likely going to be live for this later today, so make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and click the bell icon down below so you're notified if and when we do go live, and we'll talk more about timing on that here in just a second. Once we go into Saturday, we have a slight risk for severe weather from Wisconsin into Missouri, marginal threat outside of that, which is a very low-end threat for severe weather from the Michigan Panhandle all the way back into Kansas, another marginal threat in North Dakota, and another one back over in the Northeast. Main concern, damaging winds. There will be some large hail, and there will also be a potential for a couple of tornadoes. We may see a small 5% tornado risk introduced maybe in the next outlook, or maybe even as we go into Saturday, but overall confidence is just really not there right now. I think overall the chances of tornadoes will be very low, really out of the initial storms that develop as we go into tomorrow afternoon and into the early evening. Now, today's tornado threat is going to be across a very narrow corridor, as I mentioned earlier in the forecast, and this is the area that we're really going to be watching for that tornado risk to bubble up right around 4 to 5 o'clock this afternoon. This will go all the way into Wisconsin, but it will go back into Nebraska, and notice as we go throughout the evening hours, the tornado parameter values, which kind of gives us an idea of how high the tornado risk might be, are really peaking right here in South Dakota, and also even back along this corridor from southern Minnesota back into northern Iowa. There will be a lot more spin in the atmosphere in those those areas, so I do think the more favorable tornado risk will probably be in northwest Iowa, southeast South Dakota as well as parts of southern Minnesota. So those would be the areas that I'm watching for the greatest potential for a tornado risk today. Here's the timing for today. Storms will continue this morning. Most of this is just going to be gusty winds, but maybe an isolated severe storm through the morning. By the afternoon, convection will bubble up over in Wisconsin. That tornado risk will be a bit more apparent as we go throughout the afternoon, but it's still, again, a low-end risk. Once we get closer to 3, 4, 5 o'clock, storms start to blow up across South Dakota and Nebraska. Any storms that can be staying discreet will have the best chance of producing a tornado. Very large hail, still a possibility, even though it's not a hatched area today. It is still a possibility that we do see some of that. Once we get closer to 5, 6, 7 o'clock, we'll have clustered storms all over the place. We'll still have some discrete cells. Anything that can maintain being discrete will have a potential for a tornado. But one problem that we had yesterday was that there were a lot of storm mergers early on with a supercell that developed in northern Nebraska, and it never really got to produce any sort of tornado risk. I think today is going to be another similar situation where we are going to have a lot of storms that are going to merge into discrete supercells, which could overall lower the potential for a tornado long term. But I do think the short term tornado risk is definitely there if anything can stay discrete. By this evening, storms continue to move eastbound across Iowa. Overnight tonight, things weaken out, and eventually by Saturday morning, mostly just showers across parts of the Midwest. Here's a view of that over in the Midwest for today. So storms in Wisconsin throughout the afternoon. It'll stay pretty stormy. Anything that can stay discreet could produce an isolated tornado. Eventually, overnight tonight, storms move into Wisconsin and Iowa and Minnesota. Mostly just a rain concern overall. Once we go into Saturday afternoon, we'll start to watch for 2 different rounds of storms, one of which will be more linear back over in Iowa and Wisconsin to start right around about lunchtime or just after that. And then another threat back over in southern Wisconsin where we could see an isolated storm or two out in front of that line, and we could get an isolated tornado out of that, but it still remains very uncertain if that actually happens. By about 5 to 6 o'clock tomorrow night, we'll watch that line of storms move across eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and northern Illinois, and eventually it'll move into parts of central and northern Illinois where damaging winds and maybe an isolated tornado will be the main concerns. I might be going live for this as well tomorrow, so make sure that you are subscribed to the channel if you're not already. Now, hopping back to the tropics, we have 2 different areas of development. We have one in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. We have one just off the coast of Florida, which will be making landfall later this morning into the early afternoon hours. Overall, this one not really looking like much of a concern, just increased wave heights, some showers, some thunderstorms today, and then also some gusty winds, but nothing too crazy. The one in the Gulf of Mexico has more potential to actually become a maybe stronger tropical storm as it moves towards Mexico. It's going to be very similar, though, to what Alberto did, and I don't even think Texas will be as impacted by this particular system comparatively to what we just had with Alberto. So that's at least some good news there, but those are the 2 areas that we're watching for right now. Now, this is what the wind gusts look like over the next several hours, and just notice how the winds offshore stay pretty strong through this morning. Once we get closer to the afternoon, though, these winds really die down. So overall, if this does become a tropical depression or storm, it would have probably already happened by the time this video comes out. If not, it would be sometime this morning. After we get past lunchtime today, this thing is going to weaken really quickly. So again, tropical storm probably not going to happen, but we could at least get a brief tropical depression with this particular system. For the next several hours, showers and thunderstorms will move on shore across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Main concern again will just be lightning. Really, that's about it. Some gusty winds. Once we go into Saturday, this will continue to kind of bubble up offshore, but overall the low pressure system will not be very defined. So if it does try to redevelop, we could maybe see again a brief tropical depression offshore, even maybe tomorrow, but I really kind of doubt that. I think this low pressure system will fizzle by the time it actually gets to Georgia later this morning. So overall, not super concerned about this, just ordinary showers and thunderstorms for the most part across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button down below and subscribe if you've not already.